A few months ago, we put out a conversation about the deep mythology of the new Dune movie with the sci-fi writer Damien Walter, looking at what the stories we tell through science fiction tell us about who we are and where we're going. So I thought it would be great to see Damien in conversation with Jonathan Pageau, the host of the Symbolic World, and a brilliant thinker on how religion and myth show up everywhere. And it was.
I feel like what the difficulty of science fiction is that it's mostly in that space. It's mostly in that kind of imaginary, dreamlike space, which is important, which is needed. But you also need that imaginary, dreamlike space to be connected to the bread and the water, like the bread and the salt. There's something which is sustaining and which holds your family together and holds things together. And I think in that case, it's not so much.
Yeah, and I'm not going to show up as like the defender of sci-fi here and claim it's the new mythos for civilization. In a way, quite the opposite. I think where my thinking has gone over a number of years is that science fiction is essentially the attempt of the era of science to create a mythos for itself. That's a good. Because science basically kind of damaged the previous mythos, the Christian mythos for most of Western society.
This was a conversation that ranged from The Matrix to Star Trek, Elon Musk to Mark Zuckerberg, and ended by asking what stories we'd likely see over the next years.
What we're going to see, it's already there, but we're going to see it become ridiculous in the next few years, is going to be what I call parasitic storytelling, which is that there's going to be an almost pathological desire to replace all the heroes, all the intellectual property heroes from the past with some version of woke culture.
I see a push in the other way as well. And I think that's why, because I see in like my science fiction community and the fandom more broadly, actually this incredible hunger for traditional archetypal storytelling within this kind of postmodern rewriting of the stories. People really want to come back to Aragorn as the king returning.
Just to let you know, we'll be running our groundbreaking Sense-Making 101 course again starting in February, which you can check out below in the show notes. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you do too. So this is a conversation about the deeper symbolism of sci-fi. And coming back, Jonathan, you'll be familiar to most of our viewers, and I can't think of anyone better to talk about symbolism. So welcome back.
That's great to be here. Yeah.
Awesome. And Damien Walter, we had a conversation recently about the symbolism of Dune. And we talked a bit about kind of the Christian symbolism.
Humans have been fascinated by savior stories for a very long time. Like pretty much the foundational myth of Western civilization is a savior story, is Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth. And I think it's really interesting to think about the relationship between these stories, because when we talk about, one of the reasons we struggle now, or many people from a kind of a rational atheist secular background, as I am myself, we struggle to engage with like the Christian mythos now, because it's all woven up with ideas of superstition and could a man like Jesus have been literally the son of God? So instead, we're able to do a lot of the same things through a story like Dune, where that savior story, and you have most of the same stages represented, is placed into a context where we can appreciate it, a science fiction context, move it to the future, and give it superpowers instead of miracles of Christ. The theater is a sacred experience. You're not just going there to be entertained. You're going there to reconnect with the mythos of your society and to question it and to engage in criticism of it as well. And these in some ways are traditions we've lost. And we've really lost sight of what story is doing, that it's building our shared mythos for us.
I thought it would be, we kind of continued that conversation. We're talking about kind of how the deep mythology and how sci-fi is really sort of the deep mythology and the deep symbolism of today. So welcome back.
Yeah, thank you, David. It's always a pleasure to be on the Rebel Wisdom channel, and with a splendid co-guest today.
Yeah, and just to let you know, Jonathan, that Damien shares an awful lot of sort of similar frameworks. He's very familiar with John Bevacky's work and is very familiar with your work as well. So hopefully we can kind of dig into kind of the deep mythos.
That's great, yeah.
Maybe Damien, if you want to sort of start by what are the interesting topics or the pieces that you would particularly want to touch on?
Well, I've been really watching quite a lot of Jonathan's work and commentary over the last couple of months. And you've been a name I've been kind of familiar with through our sense-making community, and then started to get to know you more in detail after the Four Horsemen of Meaning video, I think, with yourself and Jordan Peterson and Vivecky and Bishop Barham. And, my work has focused initially on storytelling because of areas of my work. I wanted to understand what stories were. I couldn't find a good answer to that in the world for myself. So I kind of went back to college to study storytelling for about 8 years. And then that kind of brought me back into a lifelong passion for science fiction and fantasy. And I'd always been a fan, but the last 2 or 3 years, I've been really digging into what we seem to be doing with science fiction, because it's like a level of popularity of science fiction movies and now video games as well. And we're kind of going into science fiction virtual worlds, which I think is interesting to try and explain why are we so fascinated with this symbolism, this kind of symbolic language. And what I keep running into, and I'd be happy to talk a bit more about this as we talk, is that science fiction seems to be a kind of symbolic language that keeps drawing on older mythologies, and especially religious mythologies, and most of all the Christian mythos. And then I've been fascinated with your thinking about the continuing need for a symbolic mythos for our culture, and the relationship of that to Vivek's meaning crisis and other areas of our sense-making kind of conundrum that we're facing at the moment. So I'd really just love to kind of dialogos and see where we overlap with these.
Yeah, definitely.
Things.
That's. I think that the relationship between science fiction and fantasy is very important. I think a lot of people intuitively see them as connected, but I think they're connected. They're connected necessarily, you could say, almost, because there's a relationship between the deep past and the far future. It just in the way that we experience reality as spaces that the farther you go back and the farther you go in front, the more the coherence breaks down and becomes space for projection, becomes like a canvas or something that becomes potential for throwing meaning into, And so you see that. That's why I just wrote an article right now, just recently, about how science fiction, especially the idea of aliens and extraterrestrials, is an explosion of medieval thinking. It's actually taking medieval thinking of the notion of, let's say, foreign monsters on the borders of the world, and the foreign, and also the hybrids in the margins of manuscripts, and making it into a cosmic manuscript where all these faraway galaxies and faraway worlds are basically just playing out all these races that you would find in Pliny's maps, let's say, all these idiosyncrasies and aspects of humanity that are taken to a point and that manifest like a specific aspect. So I think that it's just the same stuff going on now that was going on in the Middle Ages. It's actually increased in a funny way. It's bigger than it was back then, but it's the same nature, I think.
I think I'm going to interject a little bit to say that we initially got in contact because the Matrix film was coming out. Maybe we sort of start at a concrete example. And obviously the Matrix has had such a huge effect on the culture, huge effect on Rebel Wisdom as well. The first film, or one of the first films that I put out, was called A Glitch in the Matrix. And it sort of felt like a really significant starting point for this. And it's obviously got such huge Christian undertones. And then the reason we didn't do it about The Matrix was because when it came out, the reviews were so poor. And I actually watched it, and it's probably one of the worst films I've ever seen in my life. And it just felt somehow tokenistic to then speak about a film that was so universally panned. But maybe that's a good place to start with something sort of more concrete, and maybe kind of riff from there into the broader kind of topic of sci-fi. What did you make of it, Damien?
Yeah, I think the first Matrix movie is still this very potent religious symbol in our culture, and we draw these other symbols for it, like the glitch in the Matrix, like you say, and the red pill, which are both about this idea of seeing through reality as we have been introduced to it.
This can't be what? Be real?
You know, and when we were first thinking of talking about the Matrix, I thought back to like 1999 and watching that at the Odeon Multiplex Cinema in Guildford at the time. And, you know, that was my experience of watching the Matrix movie, but then trying to put it into context, it had a really powerful effect on me when I saw that film. And I remember trying to talk about it with my brother at the time. And like, we just didn't have any language to talk about it, because retrospectively, I can see like life experiences that have happened since. We were living at maybe like the most secular point in history. There, and you know, it's like Britain, a very secular country, like the commuter belt coming into London, and we just had no language of religion. I had probably been to church like 3 times as a completely passive experience in my life. And here was this film that either accidentally or deliberately was like a religious experience, you know, going to the cinema for that. And I think I'd experienced bits of that through science fiction. And then The Matrix really hit me with that. And I think hit a lot of people with that. And I've had so many experiences in my life of talking to people who are fascinated by that movie, like a kind of religious text. It opened up some kind of mystery for them that they've then been pursuing ever since.
Yeah, it's funny, your experience about remembering when you saw it. I have the same experience. I didn't know anything about it. And I was getting married in 1999. And so I was busy, and I decided to kind of disconnect from media, and I wasn't doing anything. And my friend said, you have to see this movie. You have to see this movie. And I was like, you know, I'm too busy. And they said, no, go see the movie. So I went for a matinee, like in the afternoon. I was the only person in the theater. And I just remember when the movie ended, I just sat there for at least 10 minutes. And I was like, what did I just experience? It really did have a big effect on me as well. And I think that there's something about, like you said, it did reawaken in people the idea, at least of the notion of different levels of reality, the idea that reality stacks up to a certain extent, and that narrative, let's say, narrative is constructed and it affects the way that we perceive the world, and it affects the way that we interact with reality, and it frames reality, you could say. And so I think that was it was the beginning of a shift, which is continuing on today. The thing about The Matrix, which is funny, it's almost like an upside down spirituality. It's like a reverse Platonism, where the real reality is this kind of gritty, you know, non-narrative world where everybody is dirty and everybody is, it's like the body, right? There's the one guy, I forget what his name is, who says, I'm born free, like I'm not in the Matrix. And he doesn't have this experience. And the fake world is, let's say, the world of imagination and the world of ideas. But I think that secretly, even the Wachowskis love the Matrix. I don't see how they can escape it, because it's a strange contradiction in the story. Because in the Matrix, you can do whatever you want. You can be whatever you want. It's much closer to their own in reality and the way. And I heard an interview with one of them saying recently how there was a relationship between the Matrix and trans reality, because the Matrix has to do with imagination, the capacity to be what you want to be. And I was like, I knew it. I remember watching the movie, you know, not the first time, but like the second or third time, thinking, which is better? Like, what do people right now prefer? Would they prefer to be in this kind of gritty world, or they would prefer being in this video game reality? So I think Ready Player One is closer to people's actual perception of what the Matrix is. And the metaverse is closer to people will want to be in the Matrix way more than what is presented in that first Matrix movie.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating observation, actually, Jonathan, because I think the kind of storytelling tradition that the Matrix is coming out of, it was like it was cyberpunk coming into the mainstream in a way. And like William Gibson's novel Neuromancer, which kind of defined that genre, it's really obsessed with the idea of escaping the body. So the characters are like the first characters in fiction to jack into. It's not the Matrix in the book. I forget the word that he uses, and cyberspace. That's it. And like Gibson's starting point for the book was watching kids playing arcade games, early arcade games like Space Invaders. Yeah.
Amazing intuition.
They were just like in the game. They were completely outside their bodies. And that's what he wanted to explore. And I think that's why when it gets through to the Wachowskis, this idea of you can escape your body into the virtual world, I think you're right. It is very, very appealing to people. And that's why their depiction of reality is so dark. It's a place you want to escape from in there.
I wanted to pick up on something that, Damien, you said that it came out in 99, which was sort of the apex of the kind of secularity, which and I had the same experience watching The Matrix that you both did. Like it was an incredibly powerful experience that resonated on a deep level, maybe from sort of psychedelic experiences I'd had, or kind of these kind of visionary experiences that they put into the film. And you're right. I guess 99 was 2 years before 2001, and that sort of return of the religious, that this sort of like 9/11 as being this kind of transformational moment that demonstrated that we weren't at the end of history, that we hadn't kind of removed religious faith from the world, that suddenly we were in a sort of religion and the irrational had returned. And I guess you're right. It hadn't really struck me that was kind of, probably you're right, the peak of kind of techno-rationalism, utopia of progress, kind of post-religious. And that's a really interesting observation. Should we talk a little bit about this Matrix film?
I can summarize just in a few sentences that I think Lana Wachowski, and actually I'm going to credit this because I'm stealing this from a member of my science fiction community, but Lana Wachowski wrote a fan fiction about the Matrix, basically, and then was given like a huge budget to put it on screen as well. But it really has that aspect of like someone who likes the Matrix kind of riffing on it. And I'm not sure how much more there is to say about it except that there's, to an extent, and maybe it's because of what we were saying about the embodiment, like the Wachowskis have always seemed a bit confused by the thing that they made and the symbols that were in it. And in some ways they don't like it and have been trying to take it apart ever since.
You're so right, because the second and the third movie were so bad, and pretty much everything they've made since then has been mediocre. And so you think, what happened? Like what spirit, like what were they possessed by to be able to make that first movie? Like, what is it that happened to them? And then after that, it was gone, I guess. Because the second and the third are also, like you said, trying to play around it, trying to break it apart, trying to deconstruct their own story, I guess, is what they were trying to do. But wasn't very successful. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we need to talk any more about this
about the Matrix. But the thing that's interesting, maybe let me say something about the Matrix, which I think was helpful for people, is that one of the things the Matrix forced people to do was to consider meaning and language as part of the manner in which we interact with reality. And it's something which was being kind of evacuated. And there was something postmodern about it, but I've always said that postmodernism is the right way of seeing postmodernism is a way back into kind of Re-enchantment. because it understands the causality of language and the causality of meaning. And you see that in the scenes with I forget what her name is, the prophet lady, the oracle, where you realize how, because we're in a world of meaning and of consciousness, that the causality, the mechanical causality at some point breaks down, where it's like, if I tell you this is going to happen, but does it happen because I tell you it's going to happen, or would it have happened anyways? And you can't break the consciousness aspect out of the equation because it's part of it. The meaning and the consciousness is part of the equation. And so you're stuck with the conundrum of realizing that meaning participates in phenomena themselves. So I think that jolt was part of what is leading into kind of this re-enchantment that we're seeing around us, where people realize, for good and bad reasons, that realize that story is inevitable and that narrative participates in causality, meaning participates in causality, all of these things. So The Matrix was really that, in that sense, it was done really well, because it really forced you to think about that.
There's a lot of postmodern critique that generates from The Matrix, and it's become a kind of a symbol for the reawakening of postmodernism. I studied a lot of postmodern philosophy as part of studying media at university, and then I forgot it all. And then it kind of burst back into the world, I think, because of social media, and especially Twitter, and all of these terms like intersectionality, which I was kind of familiar with, but didn't expect to encounter again. And now it's really making itself felt in mainstream culture. But I think you're right. It's like a point that John Vervaeke made talking with Jordan Peterson, that the postmodern philosophers, a lot of them kind of formulated this stuff in their like 30s and 40s. And then later on in their life, they were drawn back in directions that you might even call kind of mysticism in their thinking. So that had been a kind of gateway for them.
Yeah, Derrida ended his life as basically a Jewish mystic. Like, he was talking about this semi-infinites, and, he had all this idea of apophaticism and everything, especially towards the end. It's really surprising when you read his later work.
Yeah, I guess I'm going to try and frame a question here sort of as a big picture, because the thing that unites the conversation that you've been involved in with, say, John Vervaeke, Jonathan, that I know Damien's familiar with, is sort of what goes in the place of religion. Kind of John's talked about the religion that's not a religion. And the big question is, and I know, Damien, your interest is really in like sci-fi is providing us a new mythos in a way. So the question is, like you mentioned kind of Jedi. So Star Wars is obviously contains Christian themes. So the big question, I guess, is it possible that sci-fi could fill that need for a new mythos? Or is it in some ways always going to be derivative on the deeper Christian story? I can kind of guess where you might fall out on that, Jonathan. But yeah, I wonder if that's a kind of useful frame to kind of explore.
I mean, I can maybe say that I think that for to build societies or to build communities, you need something like deep connection to the past, deep connection to community, deep connection to all these things. And then on the fringe of that, you have something like visions or eschatological projections. You have things that look more like kind of fantastical stories. And even in the traditions themselves, if you look at Jewish tradition, for example, is a great example, where you have the central text, you have a kind of core idea that we're the descendants of Abraham, we're this community, but then you have Midrash, which slips, and Jewish legends, which slips into crazy, insane stories of Jonah and the whale with a glass bottom, like going into the depths and seeing ancient civilizations and meeting the Leviathan and all these crazy stories. But they kind of are there in the fringes of the tradition as this space for spice and the space for salt. I feel like what the difficulty of science fiction is that it's mostly in that space. It's mostly in that kind of imaginary, dreamlike space, which is important, which is needed. But you also need that imaginary, dreamlike space to be connected to the bread and and the water, like the bread and the salt. That there's something which is sustaining and which holds your family together and holds things together. And I think in that case, it's not so much, it's not possible, which is why you have stories like Ready Player One, or you have stories of like the Matrix, or the idea of escaping. And that's why you have the metaverse. And that's why the way that it's presenting itself to us and video games and all of this is really like a take a break from reality and then engage in these things, then go back to your boring, body and your boring kind of. So I think that it can reawaken people to meaning and to the deeper truth, but it's not enough to fully carry them. So that's my position, really.
Yeah, and I'm not going to show up as like the defender of sci-fi here and claim it's the new mythos for civilization. In a way, quite the opposite. I think where my thinking has gone over a number of years is that science fiction is essentially the attempt of the era of science to create a mythos for itself. Because science basically kind of damaged the previous mythos, the Christian mythos for most of Western society. And generally it's acknowledged that Frankenstein is like the first science fiction novel, because you have Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, and she's kind of taking these ideas from that are being spread around society about what is a human being. If we're not like a creation of God anymore, then we're basically a machine. And if we're a machine, then you can take bits of us and put us back together in a different way. And that kind of make an artificial human, like a homunculus from us. And that, of course, has its mythic origins as well. But then you have kind of like 200 years from there of trying to figure out what is science showing us and how do we make meaning of it. And you kind of get to like an early pinnacle of that, I think, in Star Trek, like the original Star Trek. And we've taken our machines and we're jetting around the universe. And like you say, it's all actually very medieval in its symbolism. But we're going to go and meet other species and continue to trade with them. And the future is going to be like that. But then that dream kind of falls apart, basically.
Even in the Star Trek universe, it falls apart.
Of course, yeah.
It's very fascinating. What you're saying is so right. I see Star Trek as a projection. There are two strands in the science fiction origins. There's a utopian strand and a dystopian strand, which kind of become more and more extreme as you go further. And before even Shelley's Frankenstein, I don't know, you probably know of some texts, like, for example, Voltaire's Microméga. So Voltaire wrote this text about encountering giants, on a planet around Sirius and on Saturn. And the giants basically play us up, right? They're the ultimate ideal of the Enlightenment, these aliens. And they make us look bad, because we're so dirty and so kind of retrograde. And I think that that's something which you still find. You can find that, even in true UFO believers, you get that idea that these aliens are superiors. They're basically like angels. They are these gods, that are going to teach us spirituality and teach us all the science. And then you have the dystopian version, which definitely the Romantics kind of brought back with something like Frankenstein. And then you get this sense of like, no, this technique, this technical world is leading towards destruction. And so it's interesting to notice even today, you still have those two strands kind of playing, the alien as invader with these machines kind of coming and crushing us. And then the Star Trek type of utopia of the future.
Yeah. I think it's because this scientific mythos is very pleasing to some people and completely horrifying to others, especially people who are more embodied. There was a very funny viral tweet, which I'll try and recount, which is like science fiction author. I created the Torment Nexus as a warning to future humanity. And then tech startup, we have finally created the Torment Nexus from do not create the Torment Nexus. And it's like one part of our society, I guess like the Elon Musk half, is desperately trying to make this mythos of science real.
I know.
And I think,
When Elon Musk said that his network is called Starlink, I'm like, did you really call your network Starlink? You know how close that is to Skynet? It's almost exactly Skynet. Just take one word and take a little, change it a little, and take another one and change it a little. It's like you're basically, and so I don't get it. I mean, maybe they was doing it humorously, but it's not funny to me. That's for sure.
Yeah, and Facebook did exactly the same with Meta and the metaverse. This was literally Neil Stephenson's description of a dystopian virtual reality in the future as well.
What did you think mean, Jonathan, when you said that Star Trek subverted itself?
Well, it's the postmodernism, because Star Trek is an Enlightenment project. You know, it is the continuation of Voltaire's micro méga idea that, you know, that the idea that the possibility of the Enlightenment carrying us out into being free from suffering, free from disease, free from all these things, and free from all our passions, basically, and greed and all these things. But, you know, postmodernism was destroying that almost secretly already when the series started. Like there was already, the thinking was already there, and it just grew and grew to a point where, you know, now Star Trek started to look like colonialism. Now Star Trek started to look like, you know, Western ideas as being this tyrannical system that rules over all the world. And so by the time they reach Deep Space Nine, they're on the edge of the universe. You know, it was, I don't know if it was deliberate, but they put this outpost on the edge of the known world. And then they broke down the Star Trek narrative in that outward outpost, right? They went into the margins and they broke down the narrative there. They reintroduced spirituality. They reintroduced war and conflict and all these kind of passionate things. And so it was almost inevitable that it would happen, just like it happened in the world in general.
You agree with that, Damien?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Jonathan's actually identified a shift in Star Trek I hadn't thought about there. But you see this more broadly across kind of all science fiction over the last few decades, that the modernist narrative of kind of techno-utopianism, which is very dominant. And it's usually kind of summarized as hard science fiction, because it's on the surface, it's about the science fiction ideas, but underneath it is its own mythos of modernity and kind of the heroic figure of the competent scientist who will build the space rocket, and that will take us into the future and solve our problems. And this is replaced by, like that word that Jonathan said, like anti-colonialist ideas. So the way that competent scientists and their technologies are actually kind of used to dominate the alien species that are encountered within the mythos. So it's like we see those developmental stages, you know, looking at stage theory playing out in this science fiction mythos that we have, and almost one stage taking over from the other. The moderns had their time in science fiction, and now the postmoderns are coming along and rewriting the mythos with a new set of values. And I wonder, in a way, if that's happened with older mythos in the past before, maybe the Christian mythos. Have we had people, different value systems rewriting into it in that way? Just curiosity.
I'd have to think about that. I don't know. One of the interesting, I think we see that loop or that movement in pretty much all media right now. In a fantasy, one of the fantasy franchises that was very popular did it so well. Like it was How to Train Your Dragon, that series for kids. It started with these dragons as these dangerous kind of monstrous figures in the first movie. And it ended with the idea that the dragons are better than us, and that they should be completely free, and that they're actually pure and like better than us. And I thought, wow, like that's really the idea, like the basic change that has happened in society, like a move from prioritizing the inside to prioritizing the outside in general, of seeing the outside as this amazing, pure thing, and the inside is something corrupt and evil. And so that shift, it is in a way a kind of although the postmoderns would say it's not a shift to the outside, that's what it ends up looking like. So it's like the idea that the idea that the stranger is better than the local, right? In an ancient story, you would have the idea that the stranger is suspicious, he's weird, and then maybe he ends up having a treasure. Like maybe he ends up having something that we don't have and that will will increase us. But now it's stranger that way. It's almost like the inside character is always suspicious and dubious, and so we need to love the outside character, like whether it is the idea of creating stories where the vampires are the good guys, or the story where the aliens are the good guys and the humans are evil and horrible. Those are dangerous tropes, by the way, because they really do lead to breakdowns. Like if you create a story where the aliens are the good guys and we are the bad guys, and you're watching it, it's like that's a scary. It can be dangerous if you push that too far. Let's say. Mm-hmm. Or the other version too, by the way, can be dangerous. But yeah.
Well, there's a real transition like that you can see in like the emergence of feminist science fiction through the 60s. And one of the tropes that was often explored was like the alien as a lover. And you encounter the alien, and instead of them being an invader, they are somebody you enter into like a romantic relationship with. And there's lots of different riffs on that. And then you have a movie like The Shape of Water, which was like, I forget the director now. And the traditional monster is the romantic attractor in the story instead.
Yeah, that movie, man, that movie was crazy because not only is the monster the romantic character, but the family man is the horrible monster, right? The guy who basically is just a regular guy, but the family is this horrible, controlling, just and everybody in the story that has a little bit of that is this like horrible thing. But what's interesting is that this is even a bigger shift, which is that the monster, we accept that the monster actually acts monstrously. That is, the monster ends up like savagely killing the people, but we still root for him. That's an even bigger shift, because before you would have the peaceful, nice alien that just is really good and wants to be nice. And so we misunderstood him, and so he's okay. But now you have the monster that really is a monster that really will savagely destroy you and kill you, but we still root for him. And that's a whole other level. That's a whole other level of transformation.
Yeah,
like rooting for your own demise. It's crazy.
Let me try and steel man like the postmodern argument for The Shape of Water. So it would be something like the monster is representative of I would say the postmodernists would argue your true like inner self or your true identity in the world. And that kind of symbolic act of it being the lover is then manifesting your true self. So in that Steelman argument, it is odd that your true self then murders everybody as well. So that's definitely interesting symbolism.
But it's also is the reversal that we've seen in the 60s, which is super important, which is that let's say in a traditional world, really in any traditional world, you have a sense in which there's an aspect of you which is your identity. Right. And that identity is stable. You're, you're from this nation, you're from this group, you're from this tribe, you're from whatever. You have something stable. And then you have a fringe, let's say, idiosyncrasy. And that part of you is a little dangerous because it actually breaks down the identity. And so it's part of you, right? And it actually is something which secretly can maybe lead you up into some higher state. But there's always this identity part, which is super stable. And in the 60s, what happened is everything got flipped over, which is that before you would say, like, I'm a Canadian, I'm a man, I'm this, and then I have these desires. My desires are unstable. They're shifty, they change. But in the 60s, we changed where we said, you are your desires. Your desires are what are true about you. These other things, they're superficial. They're imposed by society. And your desires are what are real. And so in The Shape of Water, you're right. It's like the final embodiment of that. And it actually exposes the fact that there's something murderous about that desire and like really crazy and wild, but it's still who you really are. But I'm not sure if Del Toro totally understands the ramifications of what he's unleashing, let's say, on the world. Maybe he does. It's possible.
Yeah, another creator there, like the Wachowskis, who seems in a way to not totally understand the symbol that they're working with.
Or maybe he does, but he lives in such a buffered, protected, safe world with police and massive government that he doesn't understand what that would really mean if it was unleashed on the world. If everybody acted out their savage idiosyncrasy, then we'd just be ripping each other apart in the streets. So you can fantasize about that in a world that is extremely authoritarian almost in its state, like the state power that it has.
I'm trying to think, because we can kind of identify this shift from the modern into the postmodern through our sci-fi mythos. And it also makes me think about like the Jungian critique of mindfulness and meditation practice, which when I was getting into mindfulness, a Jungian therapist friend shared with me as a kind of warning that these mindfulness practices were made for people who had a very stable sense of identity, a very strong ego identity. And you go on a meditation retreat to break that open. Mm-hmm. And the problem for particularly postmodern people like myself really is that our lives haven't tended to give us a strong sense of identity. So the mindfulness practice doesn't necessarily work. And maybe there's something in that flipping of the symbols and the kind of the dysfunction that we see in how postmodernism manifests in the world, of that there's something that hasn't been able to form fully, like an earlier stage of development before it's taken into the postmodern.
Well, you can think of, for example, the way that it would happen in monasteries, like even in any tradition, where people who would be practicing these mindfulness type of practices, most of them would, during the day, would be ringing bells and singing songs and doing processions and, lighting candles. And there would be this really kind of communal embodied practice, which would ground them and create their sense of belonging and of identity and of direction and all of this. And then out of that, then they would have more pure spiritual practice, which would be there to kind of elevate them higher. But what the modern world wants is to get rid of all that stupid religious stuff, get rid of all that practice. And all you need to do is just aim for the highest, aim for the pure spiritual practice. But that stuff is super dangerous if it's not grounded. Like, it can really lead to insanity. Like, it can lead you into dangerous delusions and people who think they're gurus and think they're masters and all that kind of stuff. But I think you're definitely right that there's but it has to do with the idea that postmodernism sees all form, all structure as tyrannical almost in itself. And it tends to, so any type of structure, any type of practice that is formal is seen as an imposition from above of some tyrannical power. And so they want to keep the mysticism and the spiritual part, but they don't want the discipline and the formal part.
Yeah. I'm thinking because what I'm thinking is I have always actually a desire to defend postmodernism whilst giving a critique of it as well. The critique is it manifests in a dysfunctional way, and I think it is because this kind of lack of identity going into it. But the defense is that it later becomes a necessary stage for people, the kind of the deconstruction stage, to hopefully take you somewhere beyond it as well. So I wonder if there's some hope in our mythos that can kind of guide people towards that as well.
Yeah, I think so. And I think postmodernism is useful. Like you said, one of the things that postmodernism did was break away from this kind of this idea of like a universal perspective that is completely objective. And it threw people back into their own story and their own narrative. And even though they tried to deconstruct these stories and do all that, like Derrida, I think that Derrida's, let's say his attachment to Heidegger was really important, because he was really able to formulate most of his theories in terms of phenomenology and in terms of experience. So, for example, Derrida's definition of a monster, that's the definition I use. He has the best definition of a monster I've ever seen. He understands the periphery. He understands the margins. I always see him as like a prophet of the margin, you could say. And so I think that a lot of the postmodern understands the fringe and how the fringe works and the way the fringe affects the system and the way that it does deconstruct the system, and in a certain manner necessarily so. But I think that ultimately we have to be able at some point to reintegrate it all together, because you can't just have deconstruction forever. You can't just have, and Derrida himself said that he would always say, we have to reinscribe. After we've deconstructed, we have to reconstruct, we have to reinscribe. But he was always super vague about what that really meant, because that wasn't his thing. He really was a kind of jester fringe figure. But I think that that's kind of our role now, is to be able to say, like, if you look at a lot of the things I talk about, I often try to point out the necessary need for the fool, the necessary need for the carnival, the inevitability of carnival and all of these types of images. But I try to reintegrate them into a bigger story, in which now it's a massive cycle that includes the origin and the end, that includes the beginning and how that space breaks down, but ultimately leads back to an identity and back to a coherent space. It has to, or else what? Or else we vanish, and we get taken over by the outside. Basically, is the only other thing that can happen. If we're not able to kind of restore some inner type of identities, then we're just going to become food for something else. Maybe is the best way to understand it. Food for another identity.
Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with the term metamodernism, Jonathan, as a kind of posited reconciliation of the sort of modernist, postmodernist into metamodern perspective, which I think, is definitely interesting. It's sort of a placeholder for what that might look like, and an interesting topic. The one thing I'm thinking about, you talking about kind of The Shape of Water and some of the kind of stories that are being selected for now, and obviously what they're saying about where we're at. I'd be really fascinated to hear from both of you where you think things will go next. What do you think are the kind of themes that we will see in sci-fi, given the state that we're in now, and how you kind of, how you see it playing out in a sort of, whether it's sort of dystopian or, what do you think are the kind of hot themes for right now?
I can feel this discussion actually changing my thinking about it. Just some of the ideas we've touched on already, but I've been thinking a lot over the last 2 years about the need for a 21st century myth in a science fiction context, because when we've gone in two directions, we've had this kind of utopian, techno-utopianism of modernism projecting itself into space, and the Elon Musk project. And then we've had more recently the kind of dystopian direction of like cyberpunk and particularly transhumanism. And I think transhumanism, and this isn't my preference, but I don't see it going away. So I think we're going to see like a continuing elaboration on ideas of replacing the body with the mechanistic. So kind of the robot limb that the hero has, whether it's Luke or so on, being absorbed, uploading to computers and living in immortality through that route. And the emergence of, the AI, which has been a big trope of science fiction, of course. But what's happened is we've gone from like a discussion of the AI as a potential evil controlling force to increasingly the idea that it's going to solve all of our problems. It's gone from being a demon into being an angel now. And there's nothing more medieval, I think, in our culture at the moment than our discussions about AIs and what they're going to do for us. I've also been observing, and I find it a little bit worrying, but these transhuman ideas, which kind of come from science fiction, and they're picked up by Silicon Valley, and then quite a lot of our kind of ruling elite are now thinking about these. I've also seen it picked up in kind of like the conspiracy underground, this idea of transhumanism, and that we're all being driven to a transhuman future. So I think I can see this this transhuman mythos being considered increasingly real by people in the world, and it becoming their idea of what our future is or should be, whilst another group of people are desperately rebelling against this fantasy at the same time. And given our sense-making crisis as well, I find the whole complex of ideas worrying. So I'm really looking for a better replacement, but so far I'm not certain what it would be, because this transhuman complex seems to be very powerful.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think I totally agree with Damien. What we're going to see, it's already there, but we're going to see it become ridiculous in the next few years, is going to be what I call parasitic storytelling, which is that there's going to be an almost pathological desire to replace all the heroes, all the intellectual property heroes from the past with some version of woke culture. Like it doesn't matter which one, like some version that is aligned with woke culture. So it's not so much the creating of new heroes, but it really will be the kind of replacing of those heroes with their woke counterpart. And so that I see as inevitable. The other thing I see also becoming ridiculously obvious in the next few years will be the obsession with not just like the way you talked about the idea of the mechanical body. I think we have to understand it as hybridity in general, the obsession with hybridity. So it's not just the mechanical body, but it's also the animal body. And also the alien body. And so the idea in general of human animal hybrids, human something hybrid, robot, human hybrid, robot with human intelligence, all of these hybrid spaces are going to become more and more, are going to scream more and more. And the hybrid will appear as the mythological embodiment of intersectionality. And that's already there. It's already there. Netflix had a series called, forget what it was called. It was about this hybrid boy, that all these hybrids with animal parts and everything. And that's what that was. It was right there. So you have the idea of mixture as the good, and anything with identity as being bad. And that I think will become the trope that will be the more and more visible as we move into the future. But I do think, though, that there is space for. I think that there's space for something like Return of the King narrative, which is the space of it's the end of Lord of the Rings, basically. I think that the end of Lord of the Rings is, and if you look at what Aragorn did too, like the fact that Aragorn associated with the dead, like with this dead army, I think is really important to understand what's going on. Is that in order to have a Return of the King story, it has to be integrated with the hybrid. That is, the king has to recognize the value of the hybrid before getting his crown back. Because if he doesn't, then it's just going to be another authoritarian type of story. But if we do have the idea of a true integration between the king and his fool, or the king and the wanderer, the king and the stranger, then we could have, I think, the best stories. We could have the best stories in the near future if people could do something like that.
Yeah, I see, along with, and that hybridization is absolutely, I see it there. If you look in like sci-fi culture, there's a sub-community of like furry culture, which are people who are literally embodying hybrid animals in costuming. And I think quite a lot of this is an outgrowth of now like a full generation of people who are as much in virtual escapist realms as they are in reality, or possibly more so. And of course, in the digital realm, you have much more freedom about your identity, so actually your psyche is half of the time or 3/4 of the time being able to embody a completely different identity. And I often joke with people, what's the first thing people do when they first like play a 3D roaming video game? It's probably play somebody of a different gender.
Yeah.
Because of the ability to escape your kind of innate identity in doing that. But this is becoming very mixed up with our reality now. So I think you're absolutely right about the hybridization. But
and you're right about the AI thing. Like, I didn't touch upon also the idea of digital space and metaverse and all of this. Like, I think that this is the key to making it real, because obviously you can't have an animal head. It's not, that's something that is, if possible, very far into the future. And also you probably won't be able to get your head back. And so this idea of the metaverse is a place where you can enter into the margin of the world and then embody infinite variability and infinite idiosyncrasy at a moment's notice, right? You can change your skin, you can change the aspect of you. So you can really embody this hybridity in its fluidity, in the fluidity that hybridity itself represents, like the idea of the shapeshifter on the edge of the world. This is what the metaverse is offering us. And I think that the shift from the Matrix to Ready Player One is super important. When Ready Player One came out, I remember people criticizing it because they said that Spielberg wasn't critical enough of the digital space. But I think that's because Spielberg knew what was coming intuitively, at least. He knew that we would reach a moment now where, like you said, it's the solution to all our problems. The metaverse is the solution to all our problems. It's the solution to our infinite desires, and it's the solution to our ecological problem, and it's the solution to traffic, and it's the solution to all these things. It's a great, beautiful solution that will, that will kind of bring about this kind of globalist utopia. And I think that that's something that people are, at least if not consciously, they're moving in that direction.
Yeah, I see a push in the other way as well. And I think that's why, because I see in like my science fiction community and the fandom more broadly, actually this incredible hunger for traditional archetypal storytelling within this kind of postmodern rewriting of the stories. People really want to come back to Aragorn as the king returning, or, Paul Muad'Dib in Dune, someone who is taking their like hero's transformative savior journey as well.
Yeah, and that I think there's also something about Christ which is important in understanding this theme, which is that Christ is not a king or an emperor just in the Roman sense of, like of the imperator that just like that dominates over the world, but is rather a king in the sense that he also reaches out to the weak, to the poor, to the lost sheep on the margin. And I think that ultimately has to be the final kind of integrated image of what this type of story can be. But I think that for people who are interested in exploring the traditional type of stories, we shouldn't be afraid also to deal with the question of hybridity and the question of the monster, because that's where we are now. We're publishing a graphic novel right now called God's Dog, which is about Saint Christopher, the dog-headed, the furry patron saint of furries, some people have called him. So this dog-headed monster who became a saint. But it's like, how can we tell the story of this monster in a way that gives him his role, like in the world, that doesn't take away the reality of the hybrid monster, but rather tries to show how that type of character can participate in a bigger story,
I'm processing this a little bit, because in this question, which I've been asking myself about a 21st century myth, now I'm thinking that, the Christ archetype has a really strong place in there as like a representative of like some consistency, permanency, within this incredible change that we're going through.
That's the surprise. It's the surprise is that as Christianity evacuates the public sphere, the story of Christ starts to appear dimly everywhere. You start to notice that all those Marvel superheroes, all these characters that are willing to die for others, all these characters that are willing to sacrifice themselves for others, they all end up being little Christ, basically, like following that pattern. And so I think that you're right, that it's ultimately going to, hopefully that story will kind of take us through. But there are really smart people out there that are super smart and that are using the Christ story in a parasitic way. And they're geniuses of storytelling because they realize that the Christian story is self-sacrifice. And what they've been doing is they've been using self-sacrifice as a tool for replacement. So they're saying the usual regular male type hero sacrifices himself to be replaced by someone who fits in the woke agenda. It's a genius move. It's so smart. But I just hope people can notice that that's what's going on. You see it, you saw it as silly as a place as in He-Man, where He-Man disappears in his own series and is replaced by two women. And Kevin Smith said, how can you criticize that? He did the greatest thing. He sacrificed himself for the world, like Jesus. And he even said like Jesus. But then it's used to replace him. They did that in the Logan movie too. There's so many, like it's just nonstop. If you start thinking about it, you realize that it's actually a very, very smart way of doing this.
Yeah, I'm glad you see some smart examples of it, because I think the kind of woke storytelling revolution that we're going through, one of the problems, and I tried to write about this in some depth, is that when you try and rewrite the archetypes, they're so keyed into the stories that the stories on most levels just stop working for most of the audience, and the audiences kind of tune out of them unless they're just kind of celebrating the fact in itself that something that represents their ideology is now in front of them on a screen. And I think that's kind of testament to how powerful the archetypes are, that you can't just, unless you really are a genius, you can't just take them apart and put them together in different order. They stop working.
Yeah, that's why I use the word parasitic. That is, it's actually, it's taking the myth or the story or the archetype and shifting it, twisting it just enough so that it serves your purpose, but not enough that you'll stop recognizing it. And so, like you said, if you twist too hard, then it just breaks and no one cares. Right? No one cares about watching propaganda. Like propaganda only works if I can convince you that it's not, that I can make it subtle enough that you'll still care. So it's a game that people are playing to try to make sure that their ideology goes in it. Like when they go too far, you've said it. Like if you read some of the Marvel stuff and some of the it's just so bad. I mean, it's just so. Then people stop buying it. They just stop it. They just don't. But it's those that are able to just twist it enough. They're the really smart ones. Yeah.
It makes me think in a way, thinking maybe stage theory terms, that there was a stage that was really good at Mythos. Maybe like the conservative stage, and the stages which come afterwards are getting increasingly bad at Mythos because it's not really what they do. So the moderns try to science fiction Mythos and it doesn't seem to make sense. The postmodern version isn't engaging to people. So we keep going back to this earlier Christian Mythos, which was there before, because it works as a Mythos.
Which is why the ones that succeed are the ones that embody the fringe. They do it right. So let's take a traditional Greek, let's say the traditional Greek cosmology. You have the normal world that they live in, and then on the fringe you have the Amazons, and they're the upside down of our world, right? They're a world where women are warriors and men barely exist. It's like they're the upside down of the Greek kind of really patriarchal world. And so, if you want to flip it, just make a story about the Amazons and make them the heroes. It's not hard, and I mean it's not hard. That's what's going on. It's like you have you have the idea of like the hybrid monsters in the margins that are there and are kind of in these dark spaces and represent all this chaos and multiplicity. And so it's like, just make them the heroes. But it's still the same pattern. It's just now taking the position from the fringe. But that has a cost, right? Which is deconstruction, which is breakdown of attention, which is breakdown of discipline, which is breakdown of a capacity to hold yourself together, right? It's this, for the same reason that if you can embody the drunken, chaotic person that exists, like you can become a kind of crazy person that doesn't follow any schedule, that just sleeps at any time, that does all this kind of stuff. That's a possible story. It's just that it's not a full story, let's say, because it does tend to lead to breakdown, at least personally it does.
Even the Big Lebowski has a hero's journey.
That's right.
At the heart of his story, he's looking for his rug,
That's right, at least. That's hilarious. It's a great example. Yeah, it's a great example. But in fairy tales, that's exactly usually the story, because the youngest son, it's always it's like some fringe character, like a peasant girl or whatever, and then there's a journey moving, and so that can be a great story if you tell it properly. Like the transformation of the integration of the margin can be a great story, where something from the fringe, something that is not quite there, finds its way and finds its center and its story. That can be a great, like the Princess and the Frog that's an example of that, for example, where you see the frog basically, finally becoming a prince, and there's, Beauty and the Beast. There's so many stories that are like that, which could be great stories. Yeah. But Shrek is the postmodern version. Shrek is not that the ogre becomes a man, but that the princess becomes an ogre. That's the postmodern version. Like, but that's some dangerous stuff. Are you sure you want an army of ogres around you? Like, really? Think it through, people.
There's two sides to that, because then there's Kung Fu Panda as well, which I often use as an example in lectures, which is the guy who puts in no effort, has done nothing and has no discipline, who is gifted all of the skills of the one true hero at the end of it, which I think appeals to another part of our culture at the moment as well.
Yeah, exactly.
The lazy side.
The lazy side.
This has been fantastic, guys, and maybe we can do it again sometime, because I feel like we're only sort of scratching the surface. But I'd really like to thank both of you for making the time, and love to maybe do it again.
Sure, that was great. I really enjoyed meeting you, Damien. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, you too, Jonathan. I'm following the progress of your comic book as well at the moment, and congratulations on a fundraiser for it.
Thanks.
It's been really successful.